Now, I showed you before some of the ministers that were sent out to smash Tony Abbott for daring to say that maybe we should cut our immigration. And all of them were supposed Conservatives, by the way, almost like this was organised to make Abbott seem discredited even by his own. But were there criticisms of Tony Abbott and his proposal to nearly halve our immigration intake fair or truthful? Joining me is Leith Van Onselen, an economist who has worked for the Australian and Victorian Treasury and is now co-founder of macrobusiness.com.au. He's done a lot of research on immigration. I talked to him a short while ago. Leith Van Onselen, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.
Now, Tony Abbott's being absolutely smashed by the Turnbull government ministers for saying that immigration has to be cut. Now, I think the arguments being used against him by these ministers seem to me dodgy, very dodgy. But you're an expert, and I'd like to run some of them by you for a fact check. Let's have a fact check. No more of this, just insults, fact check. First, Treasurer Scott Morrison says that Tony Abbott is wrong to want to cut immigration because high immigration makes the government money. Here he is.
If you cut the level of permanent immigration to Australia by 80,000, that would cost the budget, that would hit the bottom line, the deficit, by $4 to $5 billion over the next 4 years.
Okay, true, false or misleading?
Yeah, look, I'd say that's definitely misleading. Now, Scott Morrison's really only telling one side of the story. It is true that if you increase immigration or you run a high migration program, it does benefit the federal government and the federal budget. That's because the federal budget collects 80% of total tax revenue in Australia. So obviously more taxpayers means more company tax, more personal income tax. But to get a holistic view, you also have to factor in the cost to state governments as well as the households. Now, the state governments, as we know, are the ones who are primarily responsible for funding population growth. And they do this through infrastructure, such as schools, hospitals, roads, public transport. And the state governments have actually been getting smashed by population growth. In 2014, the Grattan Institute released a report which showed that the state government finances are $106 billion worse off since 2006 on the back of their infrastructure spend. So it does cost the states a hell of a lot of money, and they don't collect the revenue. So Scott Morrison's been a little bit disingenuous there.
He's talking the game of Treasury, which was the knock on him from Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott says this is what Treasury always wants, and Scott Morrison's just captive of his own department. They get the money, makes their books look better, but the states have to pick up all the most of the costs.
Not just states, also households. So what we've seen around Australia is the state government's basically selling off everything that's not bolted on so they can raise money and then purchase new infrastructure. And a lot of this infrastructure is incredibly expensive because in cities like Sydney and Melbourne that are already built out and have very little land, they've got expensive solutions like tunnelling, land buybacks, water desalination, which costs a hell of a lot of money. Now, I'll give you a classic example. The New South Wales government is currently building West Connex, which is like a big toll road and tunnel. And that's going to cost $17 billion. And in order to pay for it, the New South Wales state government is going to start tolling existing public roads. So that means that users of those roads are now going to have to pay tolls, whereas previously they were free. And that's all to pay for infrastructure that's only required because of this population growth. And the same thing is happening in Victoria with Transurban and the Westgate Tunnel.
Oh, look, all right. I think, look, you said he was just being misleading. I'm going to go and say misleading to the point of falsity, really, if people were thinking that this was all in our benefit. Next, Scott Morrison, the Treasurer, claimed in smashing Tony Abbott that immigration has not risen for years. Here he is.
I was the immigration minister for Tony Abbott, and the permanent immigration intake that we have today is exactly the same as it was when he was Prime Minister. And I don't recall at any time there was any discussion that that should be lowered at that time. The level of permanent migration to Australia has been the same since about 2011, 2012. There's been no change.
True, false or misleading?
Yeah, look, I don't want to say it's misleading or false, but there is a two-part answer to this story. Scott Morrison's right in that the permanent migrant intake has not increased since 2012. It's been stuck at about 210,000 if you include the humanitarian intake. Now, this level is about 2.5 times the level that it was at the turn of the century. And under Tony Abbott's plan of 110,000 non-humanitarian intake, all it would do is return Australia's permanent migrant intake back to 2003 levels, which is still incredibly generous and way above the long-term average. The second part, with regards to net overseas migration, which is basically permanent migration plus temporary migration, it is actually a little bit higher currently at 245,000 than it was back in 2012, but not by about 10,000, I think.
Well, that's why I'm going to call it misleading, because when people think of migration, they're not going around checking whether the new neighbours are permanent migrants or temporary migrants. They just know there's more people from overseas. And this is why he's saying, well, no change since 2011-12. How does it square the impression he gives, no change, square with the Australian Bureau of Statistics, its latest release in our population growth just 2 months ago, and I am quoting, Australia's net overseas migration, take away arrivals and departures from arrivals, Australia's net overseas migration for the year ending 30th of June 2017 was 245,400, an increase of 27% from the previous 12 months. This is exactly why people think the streets are clogging up. There's been a quarter of an increase. It's gone up by a quarter in just the last year.
Yeah, look, and there's no doubt about that. The thing that concerns me most, though, is the permanent migrant intake, and that's because temporary migrants, by definition, are temporary and they will leave. It's a permanent migrant intake that actually determines how many stay and how big the Australian population gets in the future. And again, it is running at about 2.5 times the level at the turn of the century, and it is at extreme levels. And most of those people are obviously coming to Sydney and Melbourne.
But must also point out, looking back at his base year, and take your point of permanent migrations, when you look at the net total migration, the intake in 2011-12, the year he mentioned, was 197,000. So it has gone up by 50,000 people a year in the period that he says, don't worry, we're all sweet. I mean, I think that, again, is misleading.
Yeah, look, it is at extreme levels. There's no doubt about it. But the net overseas migration figure will bounce around because it's affected by temporaries that come in and out.
How about they bounce it down a bit?
Yes, we were definitely in agreement there.
Now, the Trade Minister, Steve Chauvo, also weighed in, gone into the pile on Tony Abbott. Here he is today.
The suggestion that immigrants play a role in pushing up house prices is a palpably absurd statement to make.
No effect on house prices. True, false, misleading?
False. Clearly false. Any economist worth their salt would tell you that if you increase demand via population growth or any other means, it'll increase house prices. And this was made absolutely explicit in the Productivity Commission's Migrant Intake Australia report that was released in 2017, which said that population growth through immigration puts upward pressure on housing and land prices in Australia, and that's a quote.
But it has to. I mean, any idiot would know that you pour, 100,000 people a year just into Melbourne and Sydney, you are going to get all those people wanting houses. They've got to live somewhere. That's got to affect house prices. Why would Steve Chauvo say something so plainly false?
Yeah, I don't know. But look, all you have to do is look at Melbourne and Sydney. So Melbourne and Sydney have had hyper-immigration the past 12 years, but they've been way above the other jurisdictions in the last 6 years. And of course, Melbourne and Sydney's house prices have gone through the roof, whereas the other jurisdictions, the other capital cities, have barely moved relatively. So, you know, this is an unambiguously false statement.
Now, he did go on to say, oh, well, look, Sydney and Melbourne, not the whole of Australia. There are other regions which haven't had house price rises. Yeah, but they're the other regions where the immigration doesn't go. So what's the point of saying immigration doesn't affect the areas where it doesn't go?
Yeah, look, he's really shot himself in the foot there.
Yeah, but this is the pylon. This is why I'm saying the government's reaction to Tony Abbott's suggestion seems to me based on everything except reason. There's something clearly going on that's politics and personal. It's not about the national interest. Now, finally, Matthias Cormann, the acting Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, someone I've got some respect for, unfortunately today came out and said, trust the experts, please.
Tony Abbott is wrong. I mean, to criticize the experts and say that somebody who's non-expert knows better is not, the right approach.
All right, trust the experts.
Well, which experts are we talking about here? There's a lot of experts out there which say that Australia should substantially reduce its immigration program. We're talking the Australian Academy of Sciences, the Australian Conservation Foundation, Flinders University, And even our own Productivity Commission, in its Migrant Intake Australia report, said that it wants the government to basically revert to democracy and work out the migrant intake based on the feedback of the Australian people. Now, we've just had
This is our country, our say.
Exactly. And look, we've just had a plebiscite on same-sex marriage. Why can't we have a plebiscite on population growth to determine Australia's future
Leith,
population
I will
size?
bet my house that neither Labor nor Liberal would welcome that. They would be terrified of the result.
Exactly. But I mean, look, we are a democracy, and if we can have one on same-sex marriage, why can't we have it on an issue that is fundamental to every facet of our life?
It affects many more people.
That's right.
Many more people.
Housing, infrastructure, affects everything, the environment.
But just also, you know, it's a logical fallacy. It's a classic logical fallacy to trust the experts, right? You decide these things on reason, not on qualifications. I mean, the experts also gave us the NBN, these record deficits, global warming programs that don't actually change the temperature at all, but make electricity sky high. They gave us the carbon tax. I mean, need I go on? Trust the experts. If they can't reason with reason and facts, then instead of this emotional rubbish, then clearly their case is not strong. So, overall final point. Is immigration too high and should it come down?
Absolutely, it's too high. The net overseas migration is running at triple the historical average of 70,000. And the second problem with that, obviously, is that the lion's share of those migrants are coming into Sydney and Melbourne, which are already crush loaded, and we're seeing that. Everybody sees it every day when they try and catch a train, when they try and drive a car, or they try and buy a house. It's just simply too high. And you know, it's not about being anti-immigrants or what have you. It's about having a sustainable migrant intake, which works for all Australian people, including migrants that have recently arrived.
And I think you're right. And mind you, the what and what have you that you mentioned there includes our cultural cohesion. I think that's under stress too. But that's a topic for another day, a whole show on just whether we're fracturing too much and whether we need to slow down the immigration intake until we get a better sense of community. But just on the facts here, please. That's what a pack of rubbish. Those ministers should be ashamed of themselves, and I've got respect for them, which I'm afraid is fraying at the edges. Leith Van Onselen, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew.